Hello and welcome to TESOL Kuwait's podcast. I'm your host, Ann Neuman, and with me today we are privileged to have Dr. Susan B. Neuman from New York University's Steinhardt School of Education. Dr. Neuman is a specialist in early literacy development. Her research and teaching interests include early childhood policy, curriculum, and early reading instruction for children who live in poverty. In her role as U.S. Assistant Secretary for Elementary and Secondary Education, she established the Early Reading First program. She also developed the Early Childhood Educator Professional Development Program, and she was responsible for all activities in Title I of the Elementary and Secondary Act. She's written more than 100 articles, and she's authored and edited 11 books. So we're so happy to have you here with us, Dr. Neuman. Thank you so much for coming here.
Well,
How did you come to be interested?
Thank you. It's delightful to be there.
I'm curious, what got you started concentrating
How did I?
on reading?
I started concentrating on reading because I was concerned. I would go into classrooms and I would see how children were struggling, and they didn't seem to be able to communicate either through oral or print. And as a result, I realized that was one of the stumbling blocks for them in terms of really becoming a student and an achieving student in class, in school.
We had just briefly talked about how that I believe students cannot learn to write, because I teach composition, if they are not good readers. And, some people believe, just let them write what they know about. I'm sorry, for an 18-year-old, I don't want to know what they know about. I want them to have ideas, and you get those ideas from reading. So I guess I'm just sort of funny about that. I wanted to ask you a few questions here. What are some strategies that you recommend for promoting active reading engagement? Because all of us teachers were hunting for something. And I know that many of our listeners want to know strategies for promoting active reading engagement.
Well, one of the ways in which we can promote active reading engagement is by teaching children how to read. They need to learn the fundamentals of reading, and that means decoding, and they need to have a great deal of opportunity for language and language comprehension. So families and teachers really need to talk to children a great deal and encourage them to talk back to them. So active engagement in both decoding and language comprehension gets them on the road to being able to read. And then what they need to do is spend time reading. I hear stories that not enough time, children are spending on actually reading independently and on their own, reading interesting books that really challenge them and are exciting to them. So active reading really requires children to spend time on their own, not only in class, with reading and reading something that's really interesting to them.
I like what you said, encouraging them to read something that is interesting to them, because I don't know if you have found, but it has been my experience oftentimes that we teachers think that we need to get our students to read great literature or something. I used to say, I don't care what you can, because I would put it aside like 20, 30 minutes to read. I don't care what you bring as long as it's not pornographic or violent. If you like reading about cars, bring it, if it's a magazine. So how would you approach that?
Well, I'm glad you asked that question because I feel very strongly that young children from the very beginning develop interests if they're allowed to. If they are encouraged by their families, by their teachers, and they develop particular interests. Sometimes we don't even understand it. It could be sports, it could be, oceanography, it could be space, but they get an idea that they get really interested in. And one of the things I think we need to do is recognize those interests and encourage them to pursue those interests. My colleague has written a lovely chapter called Islands of Expertise. And what he recognizes is that young children do develop interests. And what they want to do is they want to develop deeper interests in a particular topic. And sometimes what families can do that really supports that is encourage them to, whether it's video, whether it's all sorts of different mechanisms, to encourage that child to either play, watch, read on that interest. And while that will deepen their interest and give them a sense of expertise, and children want to be smart, they want to feel that they know something deeply, and that's one of the ways to do it. So we encourage cross-platform learning, where children are learning not only through reading, but they're learning through other mechanisms like talk and conversations, going to places, as well as video.
Could you give some real life examples of that you have observed?
Well, I can only talk about my wonderful grandchild.
Oh, yes. I have 4 wonderful grandchildren, so you go right ahead.
Right. So as early as 5, my grandson Benjamin became fascinated with orca whales. And what happened was, I don't know why, whether it was the fact that they were large. I mean, he doesn't see whales in the day-to-day, but he became fascinated in that particular phenomena. And what he would do, his father was a fisherman and understood his interests, and they would watch documentaries on television. They would get books out of the library that were all about orca whales. He began to be able to distinguish an orca whale from white whales and blue whales. So he became really an expert in that particular domain. And what was fascinating to me is that when he went to kindergarten and preschool, the children would admire him for his expertise. And he would actually play with, orca whale kinds of playthings. And because he had that deeper knowledge, he became a hero in pre-K as early as that, because he was regarded as smart. And children really want that opportunity. So it was a very vivid account how children and how parents can really support that urging and and love of a particular topic very early on.
Well, hooray for Benjamin. I wanted also to ask about, how do you incorporate diverse and authentic reading materials into classes?
Well, I think diversity and interesting materials in classrooms is very, very important. Children need to see themselves. They need to see themselves not in terms of necessarily models, like historic figures or someone very, very famous, but they need to see themselves in day-to-day kinds of activities in books. They need to know that they, among other children, have the same interests. They play, they engage, they love sports. So they're like many other children. I think sometimes we think that diversity in books means that we have to have, famous characters and teach children only about those famous characters. But let's get diversity in the day-to-day kinds of literature and books. Mm-hmm. And what we also find is that young boys in particular love informational books. They really thrive when they look at things. And when we go into libraries, we find that there are storybooks, and these are wonderful. I love them. But they should also have a fair number of informational books where children can just really become interested in a topic and maybe not be able to read every word, but can look at the pictures and can gain an understanding, and again, can really extend their interests.
Well, and I think if they're able to see the pictures, a lot of times it gives them clues for when they're having trouble with unfamiliar words and all. So
that's right.
Yes, very nice. But for many of us, especially on the college level and here in the Middle East, we actually oftentimes are having to teach reading in our composition classes. And we will have different levels of students. How do you, when you have mixed ability classes, how do you address their different needs?
Well, I think that's always a challenge for all of our teachers. And that happens not just at the college level, but actually at the elementary school level as well. I think we have to realize two things. One, there are kids and college students that actually will need the content knowledge. They will need to know the content, but they also may struggle with the actual ability to read. And if we only give them easy text, that will not help them in terms of the content they will need. Some teachers do a number of things. They put a lot of the content on audio so that students are at least getting the auditory same level of difficulty of text that others do. A lot of schools will use various study guides and study skills, and these have some benefit. And then they'll need sort of intensive supports where we actually go back to some of those skills and teach those skills in addition to teaching content. So some people will use more video for those students who will need that content knowledge. At the same time, they're working on the basic decoding skills that these students will have to have in order to be successful readers.
Yes, and it's really challenging, I think, for the students and for the teachers, because I don't know, it's just a challenge. What more can I say?
It will always be a challenge.
Yes, and I think it's always been. It's just sometimes when it's our class that we realize it more. Do you have any effective assessment techniques that will measure reading proficiency?
Well, we have lots of assessment mechanisms. Sometimes we use criterion reference tests, which basically examines, have you learned the material that I've taught? Or we have standardized assessments where we examine whether or not students are proficient in terms of a normed group, in terms of the average student. In my work, we tend to use both of those kinds of strategies. We want to know progress monitoring and how students are doing. We also want to know whether students are providing or proficient in terms of what we would expect at a certain age grade level. One of the greatest strategies that we can do is just do oral retellings. Oral retellings are a great way for students for teachers to understand what have children gotten out of a particular text and how do they respond to it. And we do it through oral retelling, and we record that kind of information. Another very basic strategy that we can do if we find that oral language is difficult for students is we'll ask them to draw pictures of the main idea of what they're reading and have them tell us about that using a picture support. We do a fair number of picture supports for our students, and we'll have them retell it, and sometimes even the teacher will record that retelling if necessary. And then the teacher and the student can reread that information together. And that will help the teacher understand what kind of issues are blocking that students. Sometimes we use things like informal reading inventory, where we ask students to read a paragraph and we examine some of the miscues that they have. And then we ask them to explain that paragraph in terms of questioning strategies. So there are many, many assessments that we'll use to monitor students' progress, because it's really important not to just have a marker of where the student begins and then where the student ends. We want to know students' progress along the way.
This brings up an interesting point, because for many of our listeners, they have no access to regular tests that are administered in the United States. It's up to them to track the students' progress. What do you recommend if you're having to invent the wheel in your classroom? Simple things like spelling tests can help us understand where students are. Oral retellings. Teachers can make up informal reading inventories very, very easily. They can do what we call cloze analyses, CLOZE, where we take a paragraph and we eliminate every 10th word, and we can see if students can fill that out. So there are many strategies that teachers can do in their room at that moment that can really be very, very sensitive to where students are and where they need to be. Frankly, there's also a fair number of free materials that one could go on the web and get free. For example, in the US, we use Dibbles a lot. I forget what the individual letters stand for, but Dibbles is free on the web. And that's a progress monitoring strategy. So there's a good deal of free materials that teachers can take advantage of, and they do have validity and reliability. There is one you may know which one I'm referring to. It's called, I think, Teaching Reading, and it has different readings from 1st through 12th grade, and they're usually on very interesting topics, but they also have little short questions.
Yes, that's like an informal reading inventory.
Mm-hmm. Have you ever recommended the reading circles?
I don't know what that is.
It's where that the students they have the piece that they're going to read, and then one person has to be the summarizer. Another person is responsible for new vocabulary. But my favorite part is, and then one person will pick what was their favorite line or paragraph and why. But my favorite one is the artist. And the artist draws something that typifies that actual article. So I didn't know if you had used that or not.
No.
Okay. How do we balance traditional and modern approaches in reading instruction?
I think it's not a matter of whether traditional or modern is the point. I think going back to my original point, we know that decoding skills are essential for children to be able to read. But we also know that children also need language comprehension. And language comprehension is a bigger skill than decoding. Decoding is what we call a constrained skill. What we mean by that is you learn it and then that's it. It's finite. But language comprehension involves vocabulary and background knowledge or content-rich knowledge. And it involves something that we learn throughout our lifetime. So we say it's infinite. And it's not a question of traditional modern. It's really a question of how do we help children develop the foundational skills at the same time we support their rich language development and their ability to engage in oral language comprehension as well as print comprehension. And the two need to go side by side. There used to be a belief that children spend time learning to read and then read to learn, but that's not true. Children begin to learn that reading is important in the very, very early years. When they're just beginning, they learn that it has meaning and purpose and delight and joy. And one of the things parents and teachers of early childhood really need to do is make sure they read aloud to children all the time so they get the joys of hearing the language and really enjoying the experience and also enjoying the closeness of being with one as you read together. So those things are absolutely essential if we are able to help our children learn to read.
Do you find that one of the problems that some weak readers have is they have limited vocabularies? Because
yes,
when you don't know those words, you have to stop. And I say this because I was once teaching at a medical school, and the teachers go, "Oh, they just don't know anything." And I said, no, their problem is they can learn all the Greek and Latin terms for the medical terms. Their problem is they don't know all those words in between. And also, I was wondering, if you find this to be true, that maybe the children.
Yes, children need a great deal of vocabulary, and they get it through engaging with families and relationships and teachers. And one of the things we know very strongly in the U.S. is that conversational turns is very important. So when teachers or parents talk to their children, they have to be responsive to the child's interests and engage them. And then if I say to a child, "Don't do that," the conversation stops. But if I say to a child, "What would you like to do today?" and the child answers, "I'd like to go outside," and the parent says, "We have to clean up," that's the end of the sentence. That stops everything. Mm-hmm. But what if the child says, "I want to go outside," and the parent says, "Well, what do you want to do outside?" And the conversation continues. And what we know is that conversational back and forth is essential for children to learn oral language development and vocabulary. That's how they get it, by talking more and engaging more with others.
Well, I'm looking for what is the magic pill here, because so many of the students, and this is worldwide, their parents do not engage with them. There are not conversations. And as a result, many of these children have very limited vocabulary. What do you do when they don't get it at home?
When you don't get oral language at home, what's going to happen, unfortunately, is you come to school behind those children who've gotten that oral language back and forth conversational turns. You're going to come to school behind. And one of the things that we have to then do is rely on our teachers to engage them in a great deal of talk, encourage open-ended questioning, be responsive to their interests, and read to them a good deal, read to them interesting books that will spark conversations, and that will help. It's never enough if the parents haven't done it at all. So I encourage anybody who's listening to this podcast to just emphasize the importance of that talk in the very early years.
Okay, in closing, I have a question of what advice do you have to a teacher who is a new teacher and just starting out?
Well, bless her heart. I've been there, and I'm sure many people who are listening to this podcast have. But I think one of the things that it would be great, if possible, is that teachers who are just starting out should use and follow curriculum materials that are available to them. It's very hard to construct every single lesson on your own. I remember staying up to 2:00 in the morning trying to get ready for the next day for work with my children. So I urged the teachers to look at their curriculum materials, develop lessons that have continuity so that they have a certain consistency and sequence in the way in which they're teaching. The first year is a hard year, but at the same time, it's a glorious year because most of us who are in teaching just adore children and are so glad to be in that classroom. So sometimes when we make mistakes in the first year of our teaching, the children will forgive us because they know we love them. And we just get better and better over time.
Do you have anything that you would like to share with our listeners before we close?
I would just wish all the teachers out there a wonderful school year. I think this profession is the greatest profession in the world, that when we are teaching our children, we need to remember that these are little children who have interests and curiosity and playfulness. And the reason we got into this profession in the first place is that we wanted to use that playfulness and that interest and that curiosity to spark their interest in learning. So I encourage teachers to not make it dull and dreary, but to recognize that these children have a wonderful playfulness and spark their interest, because that will make them want to learn forever and ever.
Thank you so much, Dr. Neuman, for sharing what we can do to make our students better readers and hopefully more interested in life around them. I appreciate your joining us today. Thank you.